welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to LUMA's continuing work from home webinar series, the only streaming series in which the producers and creators are hoping for it to be canceled. This can't go on forever, right? So as you heard from last week, we got renewed, right, for season 2. And so welcome to episode 2 of season 2 of LUMA's work from home webinar series, The Art of the Exit. This is our second presentation where we're sort of tackling our day job topic of intermediating M&A and digital media and marketing. And I'm delighted to be joined by my partner, Mark Greenbaum. Mark is based in our Palo Alto office in California. And Mark really sort of, you know, many of you know me as the guy up there talking about trends and issues at conferences and the like. Mark is the guy whose day job it is to sort of manage the strategy and execution of live transactions at LUMA. And so, you know, think of me as the front guy. Mark's the guy that actually makes everything happen. And so when we talk about a topic like, you know, the art of the exit, and we definitely believe there's an art to it, as you'll see, you know, Mark is our execution leader, who I think has got a tremendous amount of experience and insights in that topic. And I'm delighted to talk about this. Of course, this is part of our regular series, Work From Home webinar series, every Wednesday at 2 p.m., right? We call it Appointment TV. If you're not otherwise engaged, you can tune in and usually learn something or other about trends in the ecosystem. As I mentioned, we got renewed for season 2, and so this is now our second episode of season 2. The Art of the Exit. Oops. And we've got a very interesting series of topics that we're going to be covering throughout the remainder of season 2, including next week, where I will have my good friend Kelly Hui, who's an author on the sort of one of the definitive books about networking, to really come on and talk about careers in a time of crisis. It's look, it's no surprise that, you know, people are going through layoffs and furloughs and, you know, business challenges at a time like this. And I think not only are people forced to sort of think about what's next, but some may even just take a crisis like this to, even if it's by choice, right? If your hand's not forced, just think about what one might do what one might take advantage of in terms of this downturn to rethink notions about career progression and strategy. So that'll be a fascinating conversation. That's next Wednesday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So here we are, The Art of the Exit. Again, joined by Mark Greenbaum, my partner in the Palo Alto office, who heads strategy and execution here at LUMA. Welcome to the webinar, Mark.
Great, yeah, thanks, Jerry. It's always good to kind of step out from behind the shadows and have a chance to talk to a broader audience. So looking forward to dispelling some of the art. Yeah.
Awesome. So, you know, I thought a great way to kick this off was actually to harken back to a slide and a discussion that we had a few episodes ago when we were talking about industry consolidation. And we made the observation that if you look at the data of the exits in this ecosystem in the last 10 years, of the 1,900 transactions, only 96 or 5% of them were above $100 million. And if we use that as a sort of loose rule of thumb for quality exits, knowing of course full well that there are quality exits under 100 million and not so above, but just using that rough rule of thumb, that's really only 5% of all the activity. And we made the prognostication that going forward, as we sort of are approaching coming out of, you know, COVID-19 or going through COVID-19 and hopefully coming out of COVID-19 soon, that that may have the effect of accelerating the trend of consolidation. And we again projected that still only 5% of the transactions would be these sort of quality strategic exits where companies are effectively being bought. Whereas 20% were companies being sold, and a full 75% would be downright capitulations or failures, as defined as selling for less than invested capital. So obviously everyone doesn't want that category, right? Because that's bad news bears. Equity is not getting, common is not getting anything in those scenarios, usually not even equity. Even if your company has to be sold in an auction process, these things where you hire an investment bank and they write up a book and call 100 people and try to find a buyer. That can sometimes lead to market outcomes at best. But really, what you would like, and what we tend to focus on at LUMA, at least we aim for, is intermediating those transactions that are more strategic, that are more scenarios where you're bought not sold, as opposed to running a process. And I wanted to double click on this. We had this slide where we talked about the characteristics of these exit outcomes, and I think this is going to be instructive as to why it's necessary to sort of walk through the strategy and components of the art of the exit, because we all want to be in category 3, right? The question is, you really have to look at these different categories. I mean, the capitulation failure deals tend to be distressed deals caused by running out of cash or having your existing capital refuse to give additional funding. They tend to be catalyzed by investors or creditors, often tripping covenants. At the outreach scale, you're going to call everybody and your sister, right? Try and find a home for this thing. And valuation is based on, well, whatever's available, because these companies in these scenarios tend not to be too picky. And they often, the outcomes often fail to return investor capital, and in some cases not even satisfy creditors. So you're working your way down the cap table, often invariably not even getting to common, which of course is what the founders own. Compare that to this middle sort of category 2, where companies being sold. These tend to be financial deals based on whatever buyer offers the best term in that sort of banker-run auction process. It tends to be catalyzed by the company itself, hiring an investment bank and running a speculative process to sort of see if they can find demand in the marketplace. The outreach scale tends to be significant, right? Because if you're going to commit to running a process, you really want an outcome on the other end of it, so you call a lot of people. Valuation really depends on company results and how you're doing, because you're sort of selling this thing as a marketable product, and where the valuation multiple is very much an input, usually multiplied by the financial results of the company, often EBITDA. Ideally you'd want revenue, but it's often EBITDA, where you'll get a buyer that says, fine, I'll pay you 8 times, 10 times, 12 times, what have you. And this is where you will see sort of financial sponsors, participate. Now compare that to sort of category 3. These are strategic deals that are based on the sort of the fit of the target's technology, the seller's technology, and what the buyer's needs are. They tend to be catalyzed by inbound interest or nuanced strategic discussions. We're going to address that very issue in this conversation. The average scale here is very small. I say under 20, but in many cases it's a handful, right? It tends to be single digit, because we're talking about a scenario where it's one company buyer having a conversation with one target. At some point, the target may want to run a market check in order to, for schmuck insurance or to instill some competition late in the plan. We'll talk about that. But often you're not reaching out to that many people. But the valuation is very much based on the value to the buyer. And the valuation multiple is an output, not an input. What do we mean by that? You sell a company for 20 times revenue. For heaven's sakes, the buyer didn't sit down and say, I'm going to pay 20 times revenue for that business. No, what they concluded was that target was worth X to them. Hopefully X is a very large number. And then you divide that by the revenues, and ultimately that is your multiple. In other words, the multiple is an output, not an input, based on the strategic value to the acquirer. Now, if you compare these parameters, these are very, very different characteristics. This is these don't compare to one another, and yet they're all called sort of M&A. Now, because we're LUMA and we have no filter, we're going to name names. So to give examples of these, think about EdBrain, iView, Ignition One, Seismic, Verve, Videology. You're familiar with these brands because they tend to garner attention if they file bankruptcy, say in the case of like a Videology or a Seismic. These are not necessarily bad companies. They just had potentially a bad cap table. And so that's, you know, examples of those kind of companies. This middle category, we'll try DataZoo, Double Verify, Xlink, Sail Through, Simplify, and Visual IQ. These were processes that were, you know, run by banks, got sort of market outcomes. These are good companies. No castigation as to the quality of the companies, but that's the sort of outcome they got. And yet the examples we know well in this sort of third category, right? AdMelt, Clit, Datarama, Market Share, Moat, Tapad. These are the names that herald, you know, significant returns for VCs on the backs of which they can raise more funds. These are the ones that make all the big headlines. And just to sort of punctuate this, look, we have experience across the board. You know, we did the Videology deal because we were representing them previously, and that was a very strategic company that, you know, ran out of its luck in terms of with its cap table and was forced into bankruptcy, and we ended up with a strategic sale then. Still a good outcome. We co-advised on Simplify the first go around, the last go around, where they sold to a private equity firm. And we were brought on board to sort of consult in a strategic capacity there. But the preponderance of what we do are these sort of category 3 strategic deals that tend to be less than 5% of the outcomes. By the way, we put Datarama in there just to prove that, yes, you can have a category 3 exit without hiring LUMA, although we're trying to severely discourage that. And look, the proof is in the numbers, right? Here are the average multiples of these deals across these categories. And you can see, you know, the capitulation deals as expected, right? Really, really low valuations. The middle category, decent, sort of fair, sort of media multiples, 3 to 5 times revenue. But look at the escape velocity of category 3, 18.7 times revenue for the collection of examples that we utilize, vastly outstripping the performance of categories 1 and 2. Okay, so fine. That's a little bit of a recap of something we talked about a month ago when we had the industry consolidation as our topic. Why do I regurgitate that? Why am I bringing that back up? Because this category 3 outcomes don't happen by accident, right? There is a strategy and an approach to the market that will help you achieve that sort of category 3 companies being bought type of outcomes. And that's what we're going to talk about, strategic deals. What is a strategic deal? I'd say it's pretty simple. It's where you are creating value for any variety of reasons, such that the value is greater than the standalone value. So the value to the acquirer is greater than the standalone value. If it was worth the standalone value, they would just give you a multiple on existing financials. If for some reason your capability in the hands of someone that can bring you scale or that's very complementary, open new markets, something that's scarce and maybe not available elsewhere, will create value that's higher than standalone. And ultimately, that is how you get the sort of 1 + 1 = 3, which clearly is not science, it's more of an art. So what is the art that allows you to get one of these strategic exits? Cue the art of the exit. And we're going to do this in sort of top 10 style. So I'm going to sort of go through our sort of 10 components to what one should think about. And this is largely from the standpoint of the entrepreneur, of the growth company, thinking about an exit and how to increase your odds of having it be strategic. And then Mark will weigh in with the sort of practical aspects that we see in our daily advisory work. So number 10, to be Letterman-like. So the first thing has nothing to do with M&A. Obvious, and it's sort of, look, this should be fairly obvious. Focus on building a great standalone business. You want to build a great business, take advantage of market opportunities, and hopefully build something that's differentiated. If you look across the LUMAscapes, and of course there's 22 of these suckers now, over 5,000 independent companies, one of the biggest problems is that these companies are too me too, right? They're too undifferentiated. There's too many companies that do a roughly similar thing. And that is not great from the standpoint of, building a sustainable company. You want to be able to serve, one client and serve them well with a comprehensive solution set to an existing problem. There's another problem we see is people have solutions to problems that don't yet exist, and that's a bit of a tough putt. Listen, we get it. This is hard, right? We're financial intermediaries and strategic advisors. We understand that it's not easy to build code and try to anticipate market need, but ultimately that's the job of the entrepreneur. Build a team, talented team, get quality, financial backers that are not just money, but can give you great advice along the way. They make a big difference, we've noticed. And really, really importantly, manage your business. Don't manage for an exit. Too many times we see people, founding companies already with their eye on the exit. And that's just a recipe for disaster. You keep your head down and undoubtedly, good things will happen. Number 9, understand your company's key business model attributes. What do we mean by this? Well, we've identified sort of 5 attributes that get more difficult as you go down the scale. And roughly these are growth, scalability, profitability, sustainability, and strategic value. I think growth is fairly obvious. First with, product usage and then revenue. Scalability really gets to sort of operating leverage. So a company can demonstrate great unit economics, but they're simply not at the requisite scale yet to tip over into profitability, but it's looking good. There are many businesses that simply, think about it, right? If the unit economics are negative, you can't make up for that with volume, right? So doing more of something that loses money is not good. And you're really looking for businesses that have inherent operating leverage. Third is profitability. That's sort of companies with growth and scalability that tip over that sort of break-even point, and they're now producing positive either EBITDA, net income, or cash flow. 4 gets really harder in the sense that you can build a quality, growing, profitable business, but if it's not sustainable in the sense that, there are too many competitors and margins, take rates, get reduced to 0. I'm thinking about the, many of the players in the SEM space, for example, right? One of the challenges of providing a capability in cooperation with these, large monopolistic, giants like Google search. And the problem is, much of the margin tends to eke away, or some other component that sort of eliminates the, the barriers, the moats that people talk about, because ultimately you want to build a good business, you want to keep that good business. And 1 through 4 are sort of important for a standalone or even an IPO, but then there's number 5, right? Strategic value. And this is really getting to some notion that what you're doing is well-timed for the market, and there are one and hopefully numerous people that conclude that they need to own your capability, that what you're doing was, so ahead of its time that it works well in terms of a strategic fit. Obviously, it's hard to get all 5, and when you get all 5, you tend to get phenomenal exits because you've got large companies that are growing, that don't need to fund a lot of capital because they're profitable. They're clearly sustainable, so they don't have to do anything. They can maintain their independence, and yet they're still strategic, and therefore they can be picky and choosy as it relates to, selling to a strategic buyer.
Yeah, Terry, I'd add on that point, number 5, strategic value. From the eyes of a strategic buyer, sometimes that's all that matters. In fact, a lot of strategic value will allow them to look past items 1 through 4 may not even be required. But from the seller's perspective, your ability to unlock that strategic value, if you don't have 1 through 4, you can demonstrate sustainability, you can demonstrate a path to independence. The question is, who gets that strategic value? Is less that you're able to extract from the deal if you don't have points 1 through 4. But I agree, from a buyer's perspective, strategic value is kind of the trump card.
Yeah, and again, you see this in terms of some of the sort of big fanfare exits that clearly have got a lot of these components under the hood. Number 8, deploy B to D marketing. That's not a typo. It says B to D marketing. And what we mean by that is what we call, we're terming that phrase, B to D marketing, or business to development marketing. You know what B2C marketing is, right? That's businesses marketing to consumers. B2B marketing is businesses marketing to businesses, but the product is the product of the company. B2D marketing is like B2B in the sense that it's businesses marketing to businesses, only what you're marketing is not the company's products, it's the company itself. So think of business to development marketing as focused on the sort of top development executives at the key strategics. And this isn't blatant, hey, please buy me, right, type of stuff. You forge personal relationships that can lead to any variety of development-like relationships, whether that be a commercial partnership, business development deal, potentially a minority investment, or yes, they could include an acquisition. This harkens back to that, you've heard the saying, it's not a good idea to be, introduced, to be meeting your bride while walking up the aisle in the church. Well, same sort of thing here in the sense that, one must build relationships, get some equity buy-in of what these counterparties who, let's face it, right, in sort of digital media, digital marketing land, most companies operate on APIs. And so there's a lot of interconnectivity between, marketers, agencies, tech and data providers, software providers, publishers. There's a lot of points of connectivity. A lot of these companies, it'll be natural for you to have these kind of relationships. But it's like I get asked the question. We sold Moat to Oracle, $850 million. And people said, how long did that take? And my answer was, well, I got 2 answers, right? 4 months or 2.5 years. Because 4 months was actually from engagement to announcement of the deal. That's a normal sort of 4 to 6 month time gestation for a negotiation. But the reality was for 2.5 years, we had been spending time with Oracle, talking to them about the opportunity, talking to them about different players in the marketplace and what solutions they provided. And yes, that included Mode. And so it's a long drawn out process for familiarization and for, the buyer getting comfort in terms of choosing the target.
Terry, the other point that we note where doing this work ahead of time becomes very important in terms of getting to that exit is for a strategic deal. Again, if you've built your business strong on a standalone basis, they're often catalyzed by credible inbound interest, which means you've got a short period of time to talk to other players in the ecosystem, do what we typically call as a focused market check. It is usually targeted. It's a short list of folks you want to see if they are interested in competing on a price basis. A cold market check never works. If the first time you're interfacing with somebody is with a short time frame and an actionable deal to be done at a high strategic value, you're almost solving for a no simply because it's impossible to get from a lack of familiarity to there in a short period of time. You should be investing time among the parties that are your likely strategic acquirers so that you've built those relationships, they understand the capabilities, they're thinking through if this should become scarce or if if the action is called, is it something we would at some point want to own? Picking that up from a warm perspective does meaningfully increase the chances you can get multiple parties interested in a similar point in time. To say the opposite, not doing so almost determines the fact that you will not get competitive players if you have a compelling, short-fused, inbound offer to deal with.
Yeah, and if you think about the consequences or the positive fallouts of having these kinds of relationships, it's almost like perfect due diligence, right? Think of that poor buyer. They don't want to get the wrong company, right? They want to make sure that their acquisition is a success. And having worked with the company, they will see what it's like. They will see the value add, and then they can start to conceptualize what that might be like should that be owned and operated. Now, here's the tricky thing. It's hard to corral these people, right? If you think about B2D marketing, we're going to talk more about this in our dedicated B2D marketing webinar. But if I were to, I would suggest that for most startups, the grand total number of key people required for this B2D marketing exercise is likely under 100. Think about it. It's probably less than 5 people at any one particular company, and probably no more than 20 companies that logically comprise the appropriate sort of strategic counterparty. So that's less than 100 people, and these people don't tend to aggregate that often. This is the reason why we launched our digital media and digital marketing summits and invite all the key strategics and all the growth companies in the ecosystem, because we're trying to create environments where we forge these relationships, opportunities for people to meet, connect, inform, and then be familiar with what's out there in the marketplace. We also do these dinners. You've been to, many of you have been to our dinners where on a more targeted basis around a particular topic, we're trying to really sort of get the ecosystem, the right people together in one room, usually with some great wine and some really good food, and have a conversation about those topics, but really just let them have a chance to get to know one another. We think of that as sort of up funnel activities that ultimately help conversion of our day job. Number 7 is understand how your funding strategy affects your exit. So seems obvious, right? Money does not grow on trees, contrary to the image here. And look, in robust financing environments, which we're not in, you know, you could be tempted, right, to just take more money, because Lord knows there's plenty of supply in the venture community, and so the notion of just because you can raise lots of money does not mean that you should. So you really have to factor in, you know, how large do you think you want to scale this thing? If you're heading towards, you know, a trade exit, understand that, you know, the number of logical and capable strategic buyers tends to whittle as you get larger. So you have to sort of factor in that you know, diminishment of sort of number of potential strategic buyers. And then, of course, there is the dilution math, which is every time you raise money, it's a fork in the road. And rather than Yogi Berra just taking it, you have to think about the dilution math of, you know, if I take this much more funding, if I take another $15 million, then that means that we got to exit for whatever, you know, some multiple of where your latest investors are. That may take you, you know, 24, 36 months to achieve. You've got market risk in that meantime. And then if you do all the math and you sort of figure out what you might be worth at that point, it's entirely possible that dilution adjusted, you're kind of no further ahead, at least as a founder. So there's a lot of considerations to think about in and around how financing interrelates to your exit.
Terry, one other point we might make here is kind of a cautionary tale we've seen where it's had in a couple of deals is, I would say, also avoid the temptation to kind of manage that dilution by using perhaps an inappropriate financing structure. We have seen companies use debt in particular to finance speculative growth. And while debt can look very attractive from managing your dilution, it can be especially unforgiving should you have some bumps in the road where it can force your hand to look at alternatives or look at, you know, outcomes that are certainly suboptimal to other equity holders. So, you know, debt has a role, but at times we've seen folks use it as a way prematurely with speculative growth, try to manage dilution. So I think not only managing the amount of capital, but the appropriate sources is also important as you map towards unlocking that value.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Mark. And unfortunately, you know, we've seen that with companies in the sector that did have sort of material debt financing as part of their cap table, financing their growth. And as Mark says, it sort of just eliminates a bunch of optionality, right? It backs you into a corner, because if it turns out your revenue and financial results are variable and you got this sort of fixed obligation of debt, it's not, there's not a lot of flexibility there. I once made the comment that one might have thought there'd be more flushed companies, more rationalized, capitulated companies in the ecosystem, but these companies just keep going because they're equity financed, and so long as they can get to break even, they can continue to live. But if you go big and you raise a substantial and you fund it with fixed income, I mean, those folks, remember, they're not VCs, they're not in the business of capital loss. And so they tend to only finance, a portion of your needs, but they will defend that portion. So when things start to go south, they can accelerate things pretty dramatically, again, as we've seen from some of the bankruptcies in the sector. Number 6 is remember the variables for investment return. So math, this sort of math is of finance is immutable, right? There are only the formula for a return on an investment, has not changed ever, and it is really only comprised of 3 variables. It is n times 1 over t minus 1 all over d, where n is the sort of exit valuation. That's the numerator. The denominator is how much money you put in to fund the business, equity capital, and t is time. So knowing those 3 variables, understand which ones you can control, maybe which ones you can influence, and which ones are exogenous. So the exit valuation, I don't care how good a negotiator you are, I mean, you should largely take that as exogenous. And I say exogenous, of course you're going to be negotiating it, but it's impossible to predict markets, where valuations are going to go. It's impossible to predict how many strategics are going to come to the conclusion they need your capability, and whether it's one or more than one. So there's a lot of components in there that are simply not in your control. Likewise, time, maybe you can influence it with by taking a local maximum and deciding to exit it, with certain optionality at some point along the way. But it's not as though you have a complete control over that. And that's the one variable that simply just ticks away, your return just goes down from the moment you put the dollars in, guaranteed, albeit on a deliberate and slow basis. And then the only one you can control is the amount of capital that you fund the company, per our prior point. So you want to just think about those variables, which ones you control, which ones you don't, around this notion of when you exit and the impact on your return.
We see this, I think the self-awareness is important to this overall equation. I think, obviously there are some things outside your control. We certainly wouldn't recommend taking less capital than is required to grow the business and be safe. There are local maximums when you think about the duration of the investment as well. And you think about the capital you're taking, the more capital you take, especially if it is from high return expecting venture capitalist types, the higher the outcome required to get them to transact. There are points in the company's development, you think about where is that high price capital going? And that's where local maximums are things we think about. If you're using the capital to build differentiated product that is of huge strategic value, capital well spent. As you evolve towards spending that capital in the next phase to say, building things that might be redundant with an acquirer, like a distribution channel, a sales team, et cetera, that capital is equally dilutive, but the value proposition of the steepness of that value creation curve is quite different. Those are the times you think about the sine curve and the local maximums where the same value now versus later, but at a much quicker time frame can be a much better exit and easier to get alignment around the board.
Yeah, and look, there are some startups, right, that never have an exit opportunity, and that's unfortunate. But the ones that do often have to make a decision. Do we exit after Series A, which can work economically depending upon what the objectives are of the founders. Do you exit, maybe 3-4 years in? Do you wait and go long? And we've seen every machination from the standpoint of the decisioning, whether that was the right or wrong decision. It's you can't fault an entrepreneur from wanting to go for it. But I think, the notion here is they ought to be realistic, and they ought to ask for other people's expert opinions in terms of whether, you know, they think this is a good time to exit or not, because you just hate to see folks that hang on too long. Mike Kelly makes the point here that when he was at AOL and buying companies, to see some of the, you know, hubris of either the investors or the founder. I often find it can be the, you know, the venture capitalists who are, you know, they're in the business of 10X's, right? I mean, sort of 2X's, 3X's, small returns don't necessarily drive their fund return. And so they'll always be, you know, cheering for bigger is better. But I think, you know, you got to be realistic and think about where is this market going? Because if you wait for the market to totally turn, then of course everyone's a panic seller, and then valuations fall out of thin air. So that's yet another reminder that, you know, valuation and exits are really an art, not a science, right? Because a lot of this has to do with psychology. Speaking of that, let's think about things from the lens of the buyer, right? We consider the buyer's perspective. And by the way, we're halfway through here, but if anybody has any questions, fire them up. We get to the end of this, and Mark and I will address any questions you may have. Just put them in the Q&A section if you wouldn't mind. So it's always useful in a negotiation to put your you know, thinking cap on from the perspective of the other side. And so thinking about this from the buyer's perspective, right? This is complicated, doing M&A in a dynamic environment. You've got, like one that we're in, technology disruption is accelerating, right? There's a lot of moving parts going on. The whole TV world is changing. Identity with privacy is changing. There is a lot of moving parts in our ecosystem. And increasingly, for someone looking to, you know, position themselves well, you default towards M&A as the only viable solution on a timely basis. Because think about time to market and how long it takes to develop a product internally and vet it and then get customers and get buy-ins and MRC accreditation, or all these, you know, components. That can take a long time. So increasingly, you know, the disruption requires action. The action is both organic and inorganic, but it defaults often to inorganic. And yet it's harder to do than ever, in the sense that there's a lot of fragmentation, plenty of companies, surely they say they're doing something they don't necessarily do. So you sort of have to parse the marketing materials from reality and diligence. And we like to say that, you know, M&A has binary outcomes, right? You know, if you bat 350 in baseball, you're in the Hall of Fame. In M&A, you know, I don't know if it's 350, but hopefully it's higher than that. But some of the best acquirers, Google and Cisco in the 90s, these are companies that, you know, I don't know, at best batted sort of 60, you know, maybe 2/3 of the deals they did were positive returns. You're hoping that they make outsized impacts. But the reality is, you know, there's 100 cents of downside in digital, right? So you can buy something and have it be worth something close to zero. So from the perspective of the buyer, it's really, really, really important to make sure that you get the right target. Now let's think about how they go to market. This is a great diagram that sort of denotes the buyer's perspective, right? They think of if we were to sort of map out what we call the sort of proactive approach to corporate development, it would be where the strategic buyers configure their strategies, right? They think about what's going on in the ecosystem, what opportunities there are for them, the competitive dynamics, and then they configure the strategy to complement that in their roadmap. Then they figure out, okay, what capabilities would we need to affect this strategy? Now, they may have plenty of these capabilities, but where they identify capability gaps, they have three options. They can build it themselves, they can partner with someone, rent it, or they can buy it. And you know, it'll be up to them to sort of, you know, manage these filters. But yet again, I harken back to this notion that often, even for the biggest companies, you know, Google and Facebook and Amazon, it is easier to acquire something that's already been built. And so, you know, they'll run it through whatever filters and then sort of try and identify the targets upon which to pursue by way of acquisition.
Yeah, Terry, I think we find, especially with strategic deals, the most important thing from a buyer's perspective is getting the right target. And it's really not about getting the optimal price. If they got the right target, whether they a bad target that they got at a 20 or 30% discount doesn't help. And if they got the right target, often paying multiples of the price would have also worked out meaningfully. It's not just the right target, it is the right target for that particular buyer for those needed capabilities. So getting this alignment really does create an opportunity for a big value, strategic value, and then extracting that value to the target is really a function of kind of how you play out the game. But really getting the right fit, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's all about buying the right party.
So we discussed this process from the standpoint of the buyer, but then think about it for our clients, right? For the growth companies trying to fit into those capability gaps, or build product, or orient yourself towards those capability gaps. Not only should you be thinking about where the market is, but maybe you should be thinking about all these various strategics and what you ultimately believe they will need at some point in time, given your thesis of how the market develops. Because ultimately, as we've just stated, from the standpoint of the buyers, that's ultimately where they'll conclude they must own a particular capability. Number 4, understand the drivers of M&A. Listen, I'd love to sit here and tell you that that it's all math, right, or high finance, but the reality is it's very different. Remember that companies don't buy companies. Humans, people buy companies. So when if it's Google buying a company, it's not Google, but there is no decision-making body that is Google. It is a person, a sponsor at Google in one of their business units that makes the decision, I'm going to pursue this. Now they got to get investment committee approvals and what have you. But the point is, it's humans that make the decision about buying a company. Humans buy companies, not companies. And so when you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with all aspects of humans. And yes, they can be very logical and pursue the right thing, but understand the sort of the politics underlying the decision, politics underlying the strategy at the strategic. We like to say that, M&A skill set is 10% finance, 20% economics or common sense, and 70% psychology. Again, this is sort of hearkening back to this notion of, art versus science, nuance versus, strict things. I suppose, Mark, that if you were just going to auction off a business to the highest, buyers, assuming there is one, writing up the book, that's pretty rote, that's pretty straightforward. Running an auction process, I'm of the view that any hired mammal with decent training can pull that off. But to nuance something to try and get one of these strategic fits that meshes perfectly into the capability gap of a strategic and therefore achieve these incredible exits, man, that is a different skill set altogether.
Yeah, I mean, the point that it's about the people, not the companies. We see this time and time again inside a boardroom where, you mentioned if Google's going to look at something, go, well, what does Google think? Or Google passed, or Google should want to own this. And it's often a lot more complicated. You said companies don't form opinions. It's individuals that work at the companies. And oftentimes you'll have differing groups or differing politics or silos that are even internally competitive. So getting one layer deeper and actually talking to the individuals making this decision, understanding where their constraints are, their goals, their opportunities, and helping them think through it. And again, this is why that auction dynamic is often unsuccessful when you're trying to control information flow, having a one-way disbursement and hope they just come to the best bid, as opposed to getting involved in a strategic conversation, one-on-one, where you're sharing and listening to what the other side's trying to get done. So I think you've got to go a layer beneath the company level to the individual level, develop their sponsors and figure out what they need to get that sold. It's not always logical, and it's not always what an outside looking in research analyst would say a company should buy. It's what that individual is willing to kind of take the risk and go get support.
And I absolutely right. And I really think it depends on who, right, at the company. So, people will say, oh yeah, we have a relationship with Oracle, and they know someone mid-level or even senior in the corporate development function. And look, I'm not saying don't develop those relationships, but those aren't going to cut it, right? That's not where the decision comes from. Those are execution people, right? The decision has already been made, and it's been made, further upstream, right? At the business unit level or the C-suite. That's where you got to be able to have the influence to really understand the politics, understand the rationale, understand the nuance, or as in our nomenclature, the psychology of the M&A trade. Number three, remember, no is the most powerful word in any negotiation, or I might add, in the human language, right? I mean, you remember from your days in high school, right? You wanting to date the prettiest girl. Well, she said no, and that didn't dissuade you from asking again or wanting her. The no is incredibly powerful, and it very much plays a role, I believe, in M&A. I mean, I often, we hear from potential clients, growth companies that say, hey, I got inbound. These guys are calling, they want to buy the company. And my usual first response is calm down. Let's hope you're getting inbound. If you're getting no inbound, right, then all hope is lost. But not all inbound is the same. And so, I sort of, my sort of default advice to companies is, I'm not sure you should necessarily take them up on that. Tell them no. No won't scare off a serious buyer, right? If someone's determined they're going to acquire your company, and the initial no is not going to scare them off. If so, they weren't going to be there at the end of the day, because it's really hard, right? If in fact if we back up and say, if you want to be bought, not sold, and you're not quote unquote for sale, because your best alternative is your own independent opportunity, it's not, you're not for sale because that is an adverse selection signal to the market. Well, then why are you engaging in the first inquiry as to, whether your company is available or not? It just simply makes no sense, and one should play, to pick a high school term, a little hard to get.
I think it's playing hard to get. I think saying no is important, and like everything else, actions speak louder than words. And so what you do becomes often much more important than what you say. So that's why having a strong standalone alternative and the willingness to not, drop everything at the turn of a hat because some strategic buyer paid attention to you is really important, and consistently. And then look, there's saying no, the big capital no, like no to a deal, no to an acquisition offer. And there are a lot of little no's along the way. And a lot of times we can be very successful setting up gates along a courtship, if you will, to where, hey, will you share with me a whole bunch of sensitive information? Well, the answer is no. Maybe I can give you some high-level information, but we'll put a gate in place where they need to get, NDA or some other show of seriousness, like putting people on a plane and getting in a room. There's a point at which they may ask for some exclusivity. That would be a no unless they've qualified it. We know the right people have signed off on it. It's an evaluation that's compelling. And even then, that might be, pushed back out. So there's lots of little no's on the way to the big no. But the trick is you can say no, and then you need to be willing to go about executing your standalone plan and not then revisiting your no and checking back and softening it with your action.
Number two, and this may come as a surprise to folks, do not hire an investment banker to market your company. Again, this should come as no surprise, and that if truly you are saying your company is not for sale, then, the old and tired notions that an auction process, somehow creates this competitive tension. Again, it's a large, fragmented, dynamic, complex marketplace. And in that construct, there's no scarcity, right? It's not like there's only 4 of something and you're one of them that's going to go, and therefore you're going to command attention. So this is not like some other categories or commodities where auctions are really the only way to sort of reach sort of price discovery. In fact, to suggest to the marketplace that you're going to run a process, sends an adverse selection signal to the marketplace, number one. And number two is sort of tells every buyer that, okay, all we got to do is beat the next guy, as opposed to somehow achieve a valuation that you want in your head because you're going to continue as a standalone business.
Yeah, the auction dynamic's tempting, and yeah, you're right. For commodities and other types of businesses that are of the same value to many, many buyers, maybe they work efficiently. People are tempted because they do tend to drive, actionability on the seller's timetable. But I think the challenge we see with strategic deals, where again the value needs to be developed collectively, is the action dynamic actually discourages busy strategic players from engaging. You discourage engagement as opposed to motivate it, and so often can backfire.
So I think this is a great graphic that sort of illustrates how we think of how one drives strategic value without a for sale sign, which doesn't preclude competition, but it certainly doesn't start that way. Mark?
Yeah, what I love about this dynamic, this just kind of characterized the question of, okay, there's strategic value. How do you extract that to the seller's benefit? Because, I mean, strategic synergies, a buyer will want to keep as much of that to themselves as they can. They're not philanthropists, of course. And so how do you drive that strategic value? People seem to think that you need to get competition. How do you get competition? You need to put a for sale sign up. Actually, what we find is the first one may be obvious. Go where the strategic value is. So find that strategic fit, spend the time to make sure it's well known and appreciated. So you start with a big pile of strategic value, and that is not, you know, something that all buyers will have. That focuses you in on the well-capitalized buyers that can see big value unlocked. Okay, then how do you get that to your benefit? What we find is the biggest lever in these negotiations is not competition. And, you know, often competition is something you don't control. It's opaque. It's hard to manage. It's actually the fact that you don't need to sell. You have a strong standalone alternative. What we love about that lever from a negotiating perspective is, A, you totally control it, and B, it's opaque in terms of it's not like a buyer needs to be 1 penny better than someone else, or, you know, at the market to be compelling. They need to rip you off your standalone plan. And also, to your point, rather than sending a sell signal, I've hired a bank, here's my book, give me your bid, it does the opposite. It says, I actually bought into continuing on this really, really steep value creation curve that I've, you know, put myself behind. So it sends all the proper signals, you control it, and it's really, really compelling. So the buyer's got to get out in front of that with a bid to kind of take you off that path to be compelling. And number 3, competition. And again, we will almost always run a market check with, you know, with a very compelling inbound strategic offer. You will always talk to the short list of people that may also play. And look, if they do play, great, you can turn a good offer or even a great offer into an outstanding one. But what we find, and maybe it's counterintuitive for a lot of those really high multiple strategic deals, at the end of the day, they are often one buyer deals, which makes sense because it's the fit, finding the right target in that moment in time where it makes sense for that one buyer. How do you extract the value if it's a one buyer dynamic? It's, again, focusing on number 2, the lever you control is standalone. So competition's nice, but not necessary to really extract strategic value if you focus where that synergy is high.
I often find that on the competitive element, it's not really the reality of competition. It's the potential for competition.
Potential, the threat, the perception. Correct. If you say, I've got another offer from somebody else, a buyer shifts into defense mode. They said, okay, well, when that's about ready to go, call me and I'll be a penny more, or, you know, I'll lean back because I know I'm going to be sucked into a bidding war, as opposed to if you don't comment on it, they got to preempt. So yeah, and not only is the threat of competition, the less you say there, often the stronger that hand is played.
Before we go to our last item, let's tackle one of the questions that's come in around this notion of earnout, right? If the buyer says, hey, there's a tremendous amount of synergy because this is a strategic transaction, why don't you, the seller, share in that? And what's your perspective? What is your advice? Obviously, it's got to be situational specific, but in general to clients who have the opportunity to take some of the consideration in earnout that, you know, at least on paper, should they achieve it, could potentially be higher than that of a cash offer.
Yeah, so I mean, the concept of earnouts, they may serve a purpose. Generally, we are anti-earnout. I think they're challenging to negotiate. It creates kind of a winner versus loser or us versus them dynamic after the fact. And especially with strategic deals, you kind of have to keep the target company standalone to measure the earnout. And usually the point is to integrate and to fully control. They don't usually make that much sense. But the bigger question of if there's big strategic value, you know, sometimes the earnout plays a value bridge, which is like, there's a big strategic value, but we don't want to give it to you unless we realize it. Share the risk with us. And look, you know, you're going to get the best deal you can. Sometimes we'll do an earnout because we've got a good enough upfront deal. We want to play for even increased upside, and it's a palatable way to do that.
Yep.
But I think you kind of go back to, if there's big strategic value, how does the seller get more of that and not have to take the risk or take the time delay or, you know, the fact that the buyer, we're going to have control of the business? again, it comes down to your leverage in the negotiation. If the value is there, you've got half the equation right. You were talking to a buyer that sees big value. How do you change the risk dynamic? Well, they got to credibly believe that you have other stronger alternatives.
Yep.
Otherwise, you won't do the deal. So it's just like, no, I'm not doing your earnout. I'm going to stay standalone until you make it more guaranteed or higher. And I think that is better achieved, again, point number 2, by having strong standalone alternatives that are credible, rather than saying, I've got somebody, I got potential to take this to market, or threatening to be competitive in that regard. So,
right.
Good, the value's there. How do you extract it? It's about having leverage, and leverage is all about the perception of your other alternatives. Absolutely.
And then the number 1 is get the right advice. And no, we're not talking about necessarily ourselves. We do this, but these exit considerations tend to be, well, by definition, they're the single most important decision in the company's history. And oftentimes for the founder, it's the single most impactful decision on their lives. And so you got to get the right team on board. And that means everyone from board members, advisors, lawyers. You want to have your whole cadre, this is where the sort of Boy Scout mantra comes in handy. Be prepared. So we like to spend time with our clients, when entering into one of these set of discussions, to sort of set up a process for what we call agile decision making. And that's often not the full board. It'll be a deal committee, a subcommittee of the board, preferably the more knowledgeable, sort of deal-centric members of the board, key advisors, the right legal counsel, which, by the way, the right deal legal counsel isn't necessarily the company's general corporate counsel. It's situational specific. And to make sure you've got a cadre, a good group of people that can function rapidly, so that you are agile and you can address. You want to be prepared. You want to have your data room and all the aspects of it so that you look buttoned up. By the time diligence actually happens, you want to appear that you've got your stuff in good shape. And then in terms of those intermediaries, again, make sure that you're not going to hire someone who only sees one way out, which is, run a process, right? They, write up a book and call everyone. If that's not what you're looking to accomplish, don't hire that particular advisor. And then thinking about the sort of psychology element and how the buyers buy, it would be really helpful if your intermediaries, and those could be board members as well, have relationships at the strategics at the right level, the people making decisions, either running business units or in the C-suite, that are originating the transaction. Forget about the ones that are processing the transaction. You can have anybody interact with them. But the key to having objective credibility, so you've got leverage, you've got access, you're not just a paid shill that is intermediating, so that you approach this single most important decision of your company's and potentially your career by having the right team that's prepared and very agile to maximize your opportunity. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is our top 10 art of the exit considerations. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Mark, for weighing in with your pragmatic and practical sort of application based on your day job and your experience with our clients in achieving these outcomes that are markedly ahead of market norms. Again, all essential, we believe, as to necessary, maybe not sufficient. You got to have a good company, but applying these sort of components to thinking around exits will certainly help you get into the sort of top 5%, those sort of strategic exits. So thank you for joining us. Please join us next Wednesday, May 20th, 2 p.m. Eastern, when I'll have Kelly Huey with me to talk about careers in a time of crisis. This is Terry Kawaja of LUMA signing off.